There are universes that bend beneath the weight of their own myths, and then there is the galaxy of Warhammer 40,000, where myth is not a relic of the past, but the iron chain binding every moment of the present. In this place, hope is an ember drowned by endless ash, and survival itself is a confession whispered into the dark. Yet every nightmare must have an origin, and every empire, no matter how vast, casts shadows where its light refuses to fall. Imagine for a moment a world once blessed by the Aquila, its people kneeling in faith beneath the glow of the Astronomican. Imagine the thrum of manufactora echoing through its cities, the banners of the Imperium fluttering above streets where sermons and war hymns bound humanity to a single golden purpose. Now strip it away. The tithe ships stop coming. The Vox falls silent. The sky fills not with the Emperor's light, but with the weight of absence. What happens then? What becomes of a world forgotten, abandoned not by malice but by the indifference of a galaxy too vast to care? This is not a tale of heroes or primarchs, nor the clash of starships over burning skies. This is the slow unraveling of ordinary lives when the Imperium turns its gaze elsewhere. It is the silence after loyalty, the decay of belief when no one answers the prayers. It is what happens to a world when the Imperium abandons it. Before we descend into that silence together, I ask you to steady your will and stand with this channel. Like, share, and subscribe, not as ritual, but as reinforcement, as the oath of a growing legion determined to keep these stories alive. For in the dark between stars, even the smallest signal matters. Chapter 1. The Silence. After faith, the first sign was so small that most dismissed it. A tithe ship that did not arrive when expected. The administratum had always been late, its schedules bent and warped by the scale of the Imperium, so no one thought much of it, but the priests noticed. Their sermons grew louder in the great plazas, the edges of their voices frayed with strain as they told the faithful not to doubt. "The Emperor tests us," they cried from rusted vox grills, their words bouncing against manufactorum walls, "and we must be strong." People repeated the words, but fewer and fewer believed them. The second sign came in the night. The great vox towers that clawed at the sky began to fall silent one by one. At first it was interference, static pouring down like black rain across receivers, the usual curse of the warp's shifting tides. Then weeks stretched into months, no new orders, no updates. The outer colonies had always been far, but the silence was absolute now. Administratum clerks in their cramped offices continued to mark their ledgers as though nothing had changed, red ink drying in neat squares. It was a ritual, nothing more, the act of obedience without meaning. In the markets of Kethis Prime, where the streets ran with the acrid smoke of promethium stoves, whispers began to grow. The tithe has been forgotten. The Emperor looks elsewhere. We are alone. Even these murmurs were spoken softly, for the Arbites still patrolled the central districts, their shotguns glinting beneath the twin moons. But the Arbites themselves had grown restless. Their supply of munitions was dwindling. They rationed bullets and switched from fire to batons. Authority without firepower feels brittle, and the people could smell it. The ecclesiarchy doubled its efforts. Bells rang at dawn and dusk, summoning thousands into the Basilica of St. Karen. The hymn, as thundered, rattling stained glass panes, filling the air with incense so thick it choked. "The Emperor protects," the priests roared. "His light guides us." But when the congregation spilled out afterward into the empty streets, that light seemed dimmer than it once had. Faith is not destroyed in an instant. It starves slowly with each unanswered prayer. Families clung to routine as though routine itself could shield them. The manufactora still opened each morning, gears grinding, sparks showering over laborers whose hands were blistered raw. The harvest still came in from the plains, though fewer wagons returned each year. People still gathered in the taverns, drinking weak recaf and pretending to laugh at stories that once carried warmth. But beneath it all, there was a heaviness, a knowing that the rhythm was hollow. The Imperium was a machine vast beyond comprehension, and they had always been a cog within it. Now the machine no longer turned, and the cog spun useless in the dark. Children began to ask questions their parents could not answer. Why does the Emperor not send his angels? Why does no one come from Terra? The elders hushed them, repeating catechisms, promising that the next ship would arrive. But when the sky remained empty, the children learned silence too. A generation was growing up with doubt stitched into its bones. The priests warned against despair, naming it heresy. But despair is not something the law can chain. It seeps in like water through cracked stone. Workers stopped wearing the aquila on their breast. Families left their candles unlit at night. The prayers grew quieter. In the northern provinces, some refused to attend sermons at all. The Arbites tried to force them, dragging families into the streets, but the cells filled too quickly. Order could not be beaten into a people who had begun to suspect they were forgotten. And then came the hunger. It began small, like everything else. A shipment of grain lost to storms, a manufactorum accident leaving dozens dead. But with no replacement supplies from off-world, every loss lingered. By the third year of silence, famine gnawed at the cities. Mothers sold family relics for scraps of bread. Old men collapsed in queues outside distribution halls, their lips whispering prayers no one believed would be heard. Still, the basilica bells rang. Still, the priests preached, but their robes grew ragged, their eyes hollow. Even faith has limits, and the people could see it in their leaders' trembling hands. The silence of the Imperium was louder than any hymn. It was in that silence, at first unnoticed, that new voices began to rise. The new voices were not loud at first. They whispered in alleys, in the smoke-choked corners of manufactora dormitories, in the dust of forgotten shrines. Some were men and women who had once been devout, who now carried bitterness in place of prayer. Others were opportunists, sensing the vacuum long before the Arbites or ecclesiarchy admitted it. They spoke of self-reliance, of casting off chains, of survival without the tithe or the Imperium. Most of all, they spoke of truth, that no one was coming. One evening in the market square, a man stood on a cracked plinth where once a statue of St. Karen had loomed. The statue had been toppled in a storm and never repaired. He raised his arms and cried, "If the Emperor protects, then where is his hand? If Terra remembers us, why has no word come?" Some shouted him down, others wept, but many listened in silence. The Arbites arrived, clubbing him into the dirt and dragging him away, but the words had already fallen into the air, and words are seeds that grow in silence. The priests redoubled their sermons, their voices breaking as they promised that patience was the highest virtue. They told parables of worlds tested by the Emperor, worlds left to endure so that their loyalty would shine brighter when the angels finally descended. But the stories rang hollow, and the incense that once smelled of holiness now stank of desperation. Even the sacred scriptoria grew thin, their parchments reused, the ink watered down until the holy words bled across the page like shadows. By the fourth year without a tithe ship, the Arbites' precinct fortresses had sealed their gates. No more patrols in the outer districts, no more night raids against whispers of heresy. Inside, the enforcers rationed ammunition, guarding it like treasure, their numbers thinning from desertion and hunger alike. They remained a symbol, but only in memory, for the somber arts. People saw their absence more clearly than their presence. The idea of order lingered, but order itself had vanished. Out in the provinces, far from the basilicas and vox towers, villages ceased paying their dues. Granaries that once fed the cities kept their stores locked behind crude iron gates. Local headmen declared themselves stewards of their own destiny, claiming the Emperor had left them to fend for themselves. Sometimes they invoked his name as justification, other times they spat it into the dirt. In the absence of command, every man became a law unto himself. And yet, faith does not die evenly. In the southern quarter of Kethis Prime, there lived an old woman named Marin, who lit her candle each night despite the darkness of her neighbors' windows. She prayed aloud so that those still listening in the street would hear. "The Emperor protects," she whispered, her voice trembling but steady. Some mocked her, others pitied her, but a handful found themselves drawn to her faith. They gathered in her crumbling home, their prayers thin and uncertain, but still prayers. Perhaps it was madness, or perhaps it was courage, but in the emptiness, even madness could feel like strength. It was also in those years that the first true hunger riots began. A shipment of grain was intercepted by dock workers who refused to release it to the administratum storehouses. "If the Imperium has abandoned us," they cried, "why should we bleed for its ledgers?" The Arbites tried to intervene, but without ammunition, their batons were torn from their hands. The riots surged like wildfire through the port districts, and the basilicas rang their bells not in worship but in alarm. For a week, smoke rose across the city, black plumes curling into the starless sky. Fires devoured whole manufactora blocks, and gangs prowled the streets with makeshift weapons. The Arbites killed what they could, but when the fires finally guttered out, half the city lay in ruin. Hunger remained, the whispers remained, and faith had burned away with the manufactora roofs. The priests still preached, but their words now fell on ears grown deaf with need. For the people had tasted something bitterer than hunger. They had tasted the silence of their gods. It was in that silence, when the basilica bells rang out over empty streets, that the first true heresies began to blossom. The heresies did not arrive as horned demons or warp-born monstrosities. They arrived as words, as desperate ideas shaped into survival. In the northern sprawl of Kethis Prime, men gathered in a derelict manufactorum and painted over the rusted walls with symbols that resembled the Aquila but with its wings broken. They named themselves the Forgotten, claiming that the Emperor had turned his face from this world, and so they would forge a new covenant without him. They promised food for loyalty, shelter for service. In the absence of tithe ships, they learned to scavenge and hoard, their networks spreading through alleys and smoke-stained tenements faster than the ecclesiarchy could denounce them. The priests called them blasphemers. They warned that damnation was certain for any who dared defy the Aquila. But when a starving family has a choice between bread in the hand of heretics or empty sermons echoing from the basilica, their decision is made long before the soul is considered. The lines of the faithful thinned, while the gatherings of the forgotten swelled. The Arbites tried one last purge. They stormed the manufactorum with batons and stub guns, their boots hammering on iron floors, their voices commanding obedience. But the mob was too large, too desperate, and too emboldened. The enforcers were dragged down in the dust, their visors shattered, their blood staining the same rust they once patrolled with impunity. By the time reinforcements arrived from the precinct fortress, the manufactorum was empty, the walls blackened with ash. The Forgotten had already melted into the underhive, carrying with them the certainty that the law could bleed. Outside the city, villages turned inward. Travelers spoke of hamlets that had once flown the imperial Aquila, now marked with crude banners painted in animal blood. In some, the emperor's visage was defaced, replaced by kratsur, idols of stone and bone. In others, shrines still flickered with candlelight, though the prayers spoken there twisted scripture into something unrecognizable. Faith had not vanished, it had shattered, scattering into fragments too sharp to hold. It was during this time that the first dreams began. At least that was how the pilgrims told it. They spoke of visions, of voices in the night whispering promises of strength, of radiant figures walking through the famine-choked streets. Some said these visions were saints sent by the emperor to test their resolve. Others claimed they were signs of darker powers, shadows seeping through cracks left by the Imperium's neglect. But dreams cannot be arrested, and visions cannot be silenced. They spread like wildfire, carried from mouth to mouth until every tavern echoed with rumors. For the common people, those rumors became lifelines. A man who dreamed of light claimed to find a hidden cache of grain the next morning. A woman who followed a voice in her sleep discovered a wellspring in the wastelands. Perhaps coincidence, perhaps something more. But in a world abandoned, coincidence itself could feel like a miracle. The ecclesiarchy condemned the visions, calling them warp poison. But the priests had no bread, no water, no salvation. Only words, and words no longer filled the stomach. The silence of the Imperium had birthed a chorus of new voices. Each one claimed truth, each one demanded loyalty, and each one widened the fractures running through the planet's soul. Families divided. Brothers stood against brothers in taverns that once rang with laughter. Entire districts turned into fortresses overnight, barricading streets with broken hab pods and twisted iron. Kethis Prime was no longer a city. It was a battlefield waiting for its first true spark. Through it all, the stars above remained cold and empty. The great void ships that once crossed the night sky like moving constellations had not returned. And when children asked their parents when the angels would descend again, no one could give an answer. The silence was the only truth left, and it hung heavier than the hunger, heavier than the fear, heavier than the ash drifting on the wind. The world had been left to itself, and in that solitude, faith was no longer a shield, it was a wound. Chapter 2. The Collapse of Order. Law is a fragile thing, more fragile than most worlds care to admit. It is not the Arbite's precinct fortress, nor the decrees scrawled on data slates in dusty administratum halls. It is the memory of obedience that holds people in line, the assumption that punishment will follow disobedience. But when that memory fades, when punishment no longer comes, law is revealed for what it truly is, an illusion that can shatter in an instant. On Kethis Prime, the shattering came slow, like ice cracking on a frozen river. At first, it was small crimes gone unpunished. A ration thief slipping away in a crowd. A manufactorum overseer pocketing what little promethium remained. The Arbites noted each infraction in their ledgers, but with their numbers thinning and supplies dwindling, they could act on fewer and fewer of them. To the common worker, the message was clear. Disobedience had no teeth. By the 5th year of silence, whole districts of the Hive City no longer saw a single Arbite's patrol. The precinct fortress still stood, its walls high and its gates sealed, but it was a citadel turned inward, a shell of order guarding only itself. Beyond its iron doors, the streets grew feral. Children roamed in packs, their faces smeared with ash, knives clutched in hands too small for them. Hab blocks formed their own militias, welding scrap into armor, posting sentries on rooftops. Law became local, tribal, improvised, different on every street, enforced by whoever held the most food or the sharpest blade. In the manufactora, once the pulsing heart of the city, silence took hold. Conveyors slowed, furnaces cooled. The last shipments of ore had been smelted long ago, and without off-world replacement, machines that had clanged for centuries groaned to a halt. The air, once thick with the stench of oil and burning metal, grew eerily clear. Laborers who ad-lived their whole lives in that smoke found themselves staring at still machines with hands that no longer knew their purpose. Some starved, others turned their tools into weapons. A manufactorum without work is a carcass, and scavengers always gather at carcasses. The ecclesiarchy tried to fill the void with ritual, as they always did. The bells still rang at dawn, though fewer came to hear them. Priests processed through empty streets with relics hoisted high, their chants echoing against stone facades where shutters were nailed shut. Some tried to enforce tithes of faith, demanding offerings of grain or coin for the basilica, claiming it would ensure the emperor's gaze returned. But where offerings were refused, they had no power to compel. In more than one district, priests were dragged from their pulpits and beaten in the streets. Their holy vestments became rags for the hungry, their relics melted for scrap. And still, the Arbites did nothing. Their fortress loomed over the ruins like a tombstone, its vox towers still reaching skyward, but no signals came from them. Whispers said their commander had sealed the upper levels, rationing the last ammunition for his own household guard. Others claimed the Arbites had descended into fanaticism, holding secret trials in the dark, executing deserters and the disloyal by torchlight. No one knew for certain, because no one entered or left. To the people of Cathus Prime, the Arbites were no longer law. They were ghosts haunting a fortress of stone. In the Underhive, gangs grew bold. They named themselves after saints and martyrs, but their banners were painted in blood and ash. The children of Saint Daskir claimed the southern tunnels, demanding tribute in grain and water from any who passed. The Knives of Luther ruled the eastern warrens, their initiation rites whispered to involve sacrifices by fire. To the people, above, they were shadows, but in the dark below, they were kings. Even beyond the hive, collapse spread. On the plains, the harvest failed more often than it succeeded. Locals hoarded their grain, refusing to send it to the cities. Old trade routes fell silent, caravans raided by bandits, bridges burned to cinders. The planet, once bound together by the machine of the Imperium, was fragmenting into 1,000 isolated fiefdoms. And through it all, the stars remained empty. No ships crossed the night. No tithe came. No voice answered. It was in this vacuum of silence that the last illusions of order began to rot away, leaving only the raw truth. They were utterly alone. The first executions without trial marked the true death of order. Not the executions carried out by Arbites or sanctioned judges, those had ceased years before, but the ones delivered by mobs. A merchant accused of hoarding grain was dragged into the street, stripped, and tied to the burnt-out husk of a transport. The crowd stoned him until the bones in his chest cracked, his body collapsing beneath the hail of rocks. No one intervened. When his wife screamed for mercy, she too was silenced. The message was clear. The law no longer lived in books or bastions. It lived in hunger and fear. In the Basilica of St. Karen, the last loyal priests struggled to hold their congregation. Their voices cracked as they urged the people to remember their duty, to light their candles, to kneel as they always had. But fewer came each week. The faithful who did arrive sat hollow-eyed in pews, listening not for hope, but for distraction. And when the priests demanded tithes, grain from starving families, candles from those who had none to burn, resentment boiled. One night, the basilica doors were barred from outside. Fire was poured against the wood, flames climbing like hungry beasts. By dawn, the once mighty spire stood gutted, its bells melted into slag. The last priests fled into the night, their relics hidden beneath torn robes, their sermons swallowed by smoke. In the absence of faith, fear bred invention. Each hab block and village began to craft its own rules. Some declared ration systems, with punishments of exile for thieves. Others turned to barter economies, trading food for protection, fuel for water. A few adopted crude parliaments, desperate attempts to simulate the Imperium's vanished order. But without the weight of the Aquila above them, these systems cracked quickly. Strong men rose, charismatic or brutal, carving their initials into walls and flesh alike. Loyalty was demanded at knife point, and justice was delivered in back alleys beneath the hiss of broken lamps. The Arbites' fortress, silent for so long, became a symbol of failure. Starving crowds gathered at its gates, banging on its armored doors with stones and hammers, demanding the return of order, but no reply came. Once, in the dead of night, a volley of shotgun blasts cracked from its ramparts, scattering the crowd. In the morning, the bodies were gone, dragged into the fortress and never seen again. After that, fewer dared approach. The fortress had become a tomb, and a tomb cannot govern. What remained of the manufactora districts were claimed by gangs. Their chimneys rose above the hive like broken teeth, each one marked by a different banner. Within those hollowed halls, children labored to strip machines for parts, their fingers bleeding as they pried copper and steel from lifeless cogitators. Some manufactora became fortresses, walls of stacked machinery forming labyrinths where only the gang leaders knew the paths. Others became charnel houses, corpses strung up as warnings to rivals. Where once the air rang with the thunder of industry, it now hummed with the whispers of blades drawn in the dark. Yet even in collapse, there were flashes of something stranger. In one village along the river Sharn, where the crops had failed and the people starved, the locals gathered to watch a child who claimed to hear voices in the static of broken Vox receivers. She spoke of the emperor, though not as the priests once did. She said his voice was thin, faint, but still present. She told them to wait, to endure, that angels might still come. For a time, that village held together, united by the fragile hope of a starving girl. But hope is a dangerous currency. When food ran out, when no angels descended, the girl vanished. Some whispered she had been taken by the river. Others, close aimed, the villagers had offered her as sacrifice to silence her lies. Across the planet, stories like hers multiplied. Small flames of order flared, only to gutter out in smoke. Each collapse fed the certainty that no rescue would come. Each loss made the silence heavier. And in that silence, something began to change. Not just the loss of faith or the birth of mobs, but the slow, inexorable recognition that the Imperium had not merely forgotten them, it had abandoned them. Abandonment was not declared with banners or proclamations. It revealed itself in the quiet transformations that spread like mold. Where once imperial edicts had hung on hab walls, now those parchments were torn down, their faded script replaced by crude scrawls of local law. Where the Aquila had watched from every arch and gate, its wings were chipped away, hammered into dust by hands that no longer feared retribution. Each absence was a confession. The Imperium was gone, and the world was remaking itself in the void. The collapse carried a rhythm. At first, it was hunger that dictated the tempo, carving the weak from the strong. Families huddled together in crumbling hab blocks, pooling resources, guarding what little they had. Then it was violence, sudden and unrelenting. Rival groups clashed in streets once governed by the emperor's law, their weapons little more than pipes and knives. A dispute over a sack of grain could ignite a massacre, leaving alleys slick with blood that dried in the dust. By the 6th year, the very sound of law had changed. The crack of Arbeit's shotguns was replaced by the hiss of torches, the scream of makeshift alarms, the hollow thud of clubs on flesh. Amid this chaos, myths of power began to spread. Some spoke of Arbeits still roaming the underhive, armored in black, dispensing justice unseen by mortal eyes. Others whispered of priests who had disappeared only to return as something more than human, their eyes burning with light, their words sharper than blades. Whether truth or fantasy, these stories shaped behavior. A man might surrender at the rumor of unseen Arbeits. A starving family might kneel to a self-proclaimed prophet, if only to believe that someone still carried authority beyond the ganglord with the sharpest blade. But the reality was simpler. Power belonged to those who could enforce it, and mercy was a luxury none could afford. Small fiefdoms carved themselves from the hive, led by men who declared themselves governors, generals, or saints. Their rule was enforced not with codices, but with hunger, each proclamation backed by a ration of grain or the promise of safety from raids. In the outskirts, whole villages were converted into war bands, their people conscripted into service under banners stitched from rags. They carried the Aquila still, but painted over in black, a mockery of the symbol they no longer trusted. The Arbeits' fortress became a specter haunting every conversation. Some claimed the commander within was alive, stockpiling weapons until the day came to reclaim the city in the emperor's name. Others insisted the fortress had fallen silent because its halls were filled with corpses, the Arbeits slaughtered by their own despair. Neither story mattered to the starving masses. Both served the same purpose. The fortress stood not as hope or threat, but as a monument to absence. It was a hollow shell, as forgotten as the world itself. In the deep levels of the hive, where light barely reached, new forms of worship began to sprout. Candlelit ceremonies where children were marked with soot and ash, their parents chanting promises of strength. In one district, a gang painted their faces with blood and declared themselves chosen to inherit the world. In another, an old woman preached that the Astronomican had not vanished but had turned its light inward, demanding the faithful suffer without hope. Each cult fed on despair, binding the broken with promises of meaning. And as the years stretched on, the line between religion and survival blurred. To eat, one pledged loyalty. To drink, one confessed belief. By the 7th year, the collapse of order was complete. The world no longer pretended to serve Terra. The basilicas were empty shells, their relics scattered. The Arbites had vanished into myth. The administratum clerks were either dead or ruling their own gangs with the ledgers they once used to tally grain. And in the streets, the Aquila was not feared. It was forgotten. But forgetting is never the end. In that void, new memories were forming, new myths taking root, and myths, unlike laws, never die quietly. Chapter 3. The Tyranny of Necessity. When the Imperium abandons a world, it does not fall into silence forever. Silence is only the interval between two storms. On Kethis Prime, the storm that followed was not of armies descending from the stars, but of neighbors turning upon one another in the name of survival. Hunger had stripped the planet of patience, and necessity had become the sharpest weapon. In the central hive, warlords rose from the ashes of law. One had been a manufactorum overseer, his face scarred from furnace burns, who now styled himself Governor Militant. Another was a former Arbites deserter, his armor patched with scraps of cloth, his shotgun held together with wire. Each claimed dominion. Each declared their fief the true heir of imperial order, but none spoke of Terra. Their oaths were to fire and blade, not to the emperor. The people followed them not because they believed, but because survival demanded it. Bread was scarce, water rationed. To eat, one swore loyalty. To live, one marched beneath banners stitched from scavenged cloth. A man who refused found his door marked in the night, his family dragged out at dawn, their ration tokens seized, their home given to others. In such times, virtue is not rewarded. Obedience is. Cults flourished in the cracks between warlords. The forgotten, once whispers in a burned manufactorum, now strode openly through the underhive with blades strapped to their belts. They declared the emperor had forsaken them, that humanity's chains must be cut by its own hand. They fed the starving from hidden caches, and so the starving flocked to them, pledging loyalty for a crust of bread. Other groups twisted faith in different directions. One cult spoke of angels trapped in the warp, waiting to be freed by blood offerings. Another promised that if the people turned away from the Aquila entirely, the stars themselves would deliver salvation. In the void left by the Imperium's silence, belief multiplied like a sickness, each strain more fevered than the last. But it was not only hunger and faith that shaped the new order. Fear of outsiders grew with each year. Traitors whispered of Xeno's raiders glimpsed at the edges of the system. Others claimed darker things stirred in the warp storms beyond. Whether true or rumor, the effect was the same. Every district, every village, every gang turned inward. Walls were built from scavenged metal, gates reinforced with chain and stone. The world fractured into countless fortresses, each glaring at its neighbor, each sharpening knives for the raid they knew would come. In one such district, a boy of 12 became a symbol. His family had been slaughtered when they refused to kneel to the Governor Militant. Alone, he survived in the alleys, scavenging scraps, slipping past patrols. One night, cornered by enforcers, he struck first, driving a rusted blade into the throat of a soldier. Word spread faster than the blood cooled. The people called him a martyr, the ghost child who would not kneel. Within weeks, gangs carried his name like a banner, painting crude images of his face on walls. To the Governor Militant, he was a threat. To the people, he was a spark. Such sparks were dangerous, for they reminded the world of rebellion not sanctioned by hunger. The warlords understood this. They tightened their grips, rationing food not as sustenance, but as punishment and reward. A district that resisted was starved. A family that obeyed received grain. Tyranny was not draped in ideology or scripture now. It was measured in meals, and for many, a full belly outweighed freedom, outweighed dignity, outweighed anything except the gnawing void of hunger. The Arbite's fortress, long silent, became a prize in these new wars. Rumors spread that its vaults still contained stores of munitions, perhaps even food. Warlords gathered forces to storm it, but its gates held fast. Some claimed to see gunfire in its towers, suggesting life within. Others swore it was empty, a tomb guarding nothing. But the fortress remained, unclaimed and untaken, a reminder of the order that once was and the tyranny that now reigned. The silence of abandonment had ended. In its place came the roar of necessity, and necessity does not whisper. It commands. Necessity did not merely command, it reshaped the world in its own cruel image. The old rhythms of life, once dictated by the ecclesiarchy's bells and the administratum's ledgers, were replaced by harsher cycles. Dawn no longer meant prayer, it meant the scramble for food. Nightfall no longer meant rest, it meant fear, fear of raids, of fire at the door, of knives glinting in the dark. Every district forged its own hierarchy, and each was harsher than the last. In the eastern hive sprawl, the knives of Luther had seized the manufactora ruins. Their leader, draped in chains taken from Arbite's prisoners, declared himself the first blade. Under his rule, food was earned through combat. Every week, captives and volunteers alike were thrown into pits lit by burning promethium. Victors ate, the dead fed the flames. The people called it justice, though what they meant was survival. Far to the south, the children of Saint Daskir grew into a theocracy of hunger. Their prophetess preached that famine itself was the emperor's test, that to endure it was to prove loyalty. She rationed food only to those who attended her sermons, and her enforcers, clad in bones and ash, scoured the streets for dissenters. To starve was heresy. To eat was worship. In a world abandoned, even cruelty could masquerade as faith. Outside the hives, the plains were no safer. Villages once bound by trade became armed camps, their gates shut, their roads barred. Warlords conscripted every able body, pressing farmers into militias, teaching them to fight with tools turned into weapons. When the grain failed, as it often did, those militias turned on neighboring settlements, taking by force what the earth no longer yielded. Raids were swift, brutal, and without mercy. Whole villages were put to the torch, their survivors scattered into the wastelands. The smoke of burning fields hung over the horizon like a sec. On dawn, a constant reminder that order was no more. And yet through this brutality, a grim kind of stability emerged. The world had stopped pretending. No one spoke of Terra anymore, except as a curse. The Aquila still clung to some walls, but it was defaced, its wings broken, its gaze blind. The idea of the Imperium remained in the mouths of warlords and prophets, twisted into justification for whatever cruelty kept them in power. Some declared that the emperor had chosen them as his new stewards. Others spat his name into the dust, claiming their rule was proof of his death. Both wielded the same truth. People obeyed, not because they believed, but because they hungered. It was during this time that the first true rumors of outsiders returned. A caravan of scavengers claimed to have seen lights in the sky, moving not like meteors but like ships. Another spoke of raiders with armor not forged on Kethis Prime, their weapons too precise, their cruelty too alien. Whether these were Xenos, pirates, or hallucinations born of hunger, the effect was immediate. Warlords doubled their fortifications. Cults whispered of deliverance or damnation falling from the stars. For the first time since the silence began, the people looked upward again, and what they felt was not hope. It was dread. The Arbite's fortress, still untouched, loomed larger in the imagination. Some claimed that those mysterious ships sought its vaults, that the fortress itself held secrets worth killing a world for. Others whispered that its commander had made a pact with powers unseen, holding the gates shut until the day he could rise as master over all. But the gates never opened. The fortress remained silent, its towers staring coldly across a world that had torn itself apart. In the tyranny of necessity, even silence became a weapon. The world was no longer held together by faith or law, but by fear. Fear of starvation, fear of neighbors, fear of the dark sky above. In that fear, necessity carved new truths, truths sharper than any edict of the administratum. On Kethis Prime, the people had begun to understand that survival itself was now the only creed. In the Western Hive, a man named Varric seized control of the waterworks. Once a minor engineer, his knowledge of pumps and filters gave him power greater than any warlord's sword. He rationed water not by faith or loyalty, but by labor. Those who worked in his fields or built his barricades received clean rations. Those who resisted were cut off, forced to drink from the poisoned runoff that gathered in the drains. The people cursed his name, but they obeyed, for thirst is a tyrant stronger than hunger. His banners, simple blue marks painted over rust, were visible for miles, a warning and a promise both. Elsewhere, cruelty wore different masks. In the ashlands beyond the city, scavenger clans rose from the bones of the manufactora. They hunted not just for scrap, but for people. Caravans were dragged down into the dust, their survivors branded and sold back to the hive in exchange for grain. The clans claimed they were simply continuing the tithes that had once bound them to the Imperium, but now the tithe was to themselves. Every body was coin, every coin survival. Even among the faithful, necessity hollowed devotion into something harsher. In the shattered basilica ruins, a group calling themselves the Ash Apostles built altars of bone and slag. Their liturgy was simple. Those who could not fight were sacrificed so the rest might live. Victims were burned in pits of promethium, their ashes mixed with grain that was rationed out to the loyal. "The Emperor feeds us still," their leader proclaimed, his hands blackened with soot. And in their hunger, people knelt. Children grew up in this world never knowing the rhythm of bells or the sound of tithe ships breaking the sky. For them, necessity was not a collapse but the only truth they had ever known. They learned to wield knives before they could read. They learned that a promise was nothing without a blade to enforce it. Some still traced the aquila on their chests, but their parents had stopped correcting them when the wings came out uneven. The symbol meant nothing now. It was a gesture, a habit, no more. Yet even in this descent, stories of defiance flickered. In the Underhive, rumors spread of a group calling themselves the Remnants. They refused loyalty to any warlord, refused the chains of cults. They lived on scraps, raiding both tyrants and prophets alike, vanishing into the labyrinth of tunnels before retribution could find them. To some, they were bandits. To others, they were proof that survival did not require surrender. Their symbol was not the aquila, nor any saint, but a simple flame daubed in red. The flame meant nothing, and yet it meant everything. Necessity had bred cruelty, but it had also bred cunning. The people of Kethis Prime had become predators, scavengers, zealots, and martyrs, all bound together by the single thread of survival. They no longer asked if the Imperium would return. That question was gone, forgotten, drowned beneath the immediacy of hunger and fear. The new question was simpler, sharper. How much will I pay to live another day? In that question lay the truest tyranny. For when survival is the only law, mercy dies first, and with it, every trace of what the Imperium once claimed to be. Chapter 4. The Echo of Legends. Rumor is a weapon as sharp as any blade, and on Kethis Prime, it became the only one that could reach beyond barricades and famine. With the Imperium silent, with warlords clawing at each other in the dust, the people turned their ears toward whispers. in the darkened alleys of the hive, in taverns where candles burned low, in the watchtowers of ash-choked plains, stories began to spread. At first, they were stories of survival twisted into parables. A scavenger who fought off 10 men with nothing but a shard of steel. A mother who walked into the wastelands and returned with grain enough to feed her entire block. Each tale grew with the telling, until survival itself became legend, and ordinary people were painted in the colors of saints. The hunger that had destroyed faith in the Aquila now created faith in neighbors, in strangers, in anyone who could be imagined as more than human. Then came visions. A miner in the underhive claimed to dream of golden light flooding the tunnels, a figure with eyes like suns promising that the emperor had not abandoned them, only hidden his face until the faithful proved worthy. Another, a child in the northern districts, spoke of shadows with voices that whispered in kindness, offering bread in exchange for prayers not to the emperor, but to something unnamed. Both visions spread like plague. Entire districts argued in the streets over which vision was true, which promised to believe. Priests were gone, arbites were silent, and so the people themselves became the arbiters of truth. In time, the visions became movements, the dreamers of light carrying torches in procession, chanting hymns that twisted the old litanies into new songs. The whispered, who wore hoods of ash and spoke only in murmurs, claiming silence was the truest prayer. Neither could prove their faith, but proof was no longer the point. What mattered was belonging, the warmth of others in a world turned cold. Beyond the hive, the myths deepened. Villages abandoned by caravans spoke of wandering saints who walked the ashlands barefoot, their blood turning barren soil fertile. Others claimed to see black ships streak across the sky, heralds of a return, though no one could agree if the return was salvation or conquest. Every streak of light above, every flicker of the stars, became scripture waiting to be written. The Arbite's fortress, long a tomb of silence, entered these stories too. Some said its gates would open when the emperor returned, disgorging angels clad in armor blacker than night. Others claimed the Arbites within had turned to heresy, feeding on the flesh of the innocent, their fortress a maw that would one day consume the city. The truth mattered less than the telling. The fortress became a mirror, each story painting it in different hues, each rumor reshaping its stone. And still, the silence of the void pressed down. No tithe ships, no vox orders, no banners from Terra, only the legends echoing louder each year until they were not whispers but roars. For a people starved of order, story became the only nourishment left. It was in that hunger for meaning that the strangest accounts began. Candles flickering without wind, statues weeping rust, voices heard in the static of broken vox units. Some swore these were signs of the emperor's gaze returning. Others whispered that the warp itself had slipped closer, that the walls between worlds were thinning. None could prove it. All believed something. Because belief, like hunger, cannot be starved forever. It must find food, even if that food is only legend. Legends have a way of growing teeth. What began as whispers of visions soon hardened into rival truths, and rival truths on a starving world are invitations to war. The dreamers of light spread through the hive first. They carried candles into the manufactora ruins, their wax stubs flickering against steel walls scarred by violence. They sang hymns that no longer matched the ecclesiarchy's canon, songs of a radiant emperor who had hidden himself so that his people might learn endurance. To those who had lost everything, the warmth of a torchlit procession was enough to believe in. They promised the light would return, and their followers clung to that promise with trembling hands. But in the underhive, the whispered grew just as strong. They knelt in silence in forgotten tunnels, pressing their foreheads to cold stone, listening for voices in the dark. They claimed the emperor had spoken too long, and that silence itself was his final command. Their leaders taught that the old prayers were lies, that the only true devotion was to bow the head and hear the voice beneath the stillness. To outsiders, they seemed mad. To their followers, they seemed the only ones who understood what abandonment felt like. Inevitably, the two met in the streets. Torches clashed with hoods, hymns clashed with whispers, and blood soaked into cracked ferrocrete, where once the Arbites had patrolled. Survivors limped back to their districts, carrying stories of betrayal, painting enemies in darker hues until every confrontation became a crusade. Within months, the hive was a battlefield not only of gangs and warlords but of legends themselves, each one demanding loyalty with the same hunger that once fed the Aquila. Beyond the hive, the myths grew stranger still. In one village, a shepherd swore that a figure of iron had walked the hills at dusk, its eyes burning green, its voice like the grinding of ancient stone. Some fell to their knees, claiming it was a saint returned. Others fled, whispering of Xenos. Whether it was vision, rumor, or reality, the story spread faster than the figure could walk. By the time it reached the hive, the tale had already shifted into prophecy, that one day the earth itself would awaken and claim the faithless. On the plains, farmers began leaving offerings not at shrines, but at crossroads, whispering prayers to faceless powers that might deliver rain. In the ashlands, scavenger clans painted their bodies with soot and declared themselves chosen by voices only they could hear. Everywhere, belief fragmented, twisted, multiplied. Each fragment claimed dominion over the truth. Each demanded obedience. And for a starving, broken people, obedience felt like safety. Even the Arbites' fortress, silent for so long, became a battlefield of rumor. One story said its commander had become a prophet, fasting until visions filled his skull, his men surviving only on faith. Another claimed the fortress was empty, its gates sealed because the Arbites had fled into the warp itself. Others whispered that they had never been human at all, that the black armored enforcers were automata, their silence the proof of their true nature. No one knew, and no one could, but the stories spread like smoke, seeping into every street, until the fortress was no longer a building of stone and steel, but a cathedral of rumor. The collapse of order had left a void, and into that void poured legend, prophecy, and myth. For a world abandoned, the silence of the stars was too vast to endure without meaning. And so they filled it, each story an echo louder than the last. But echoes, when left unchecked, become thunder, and thunder demands a storm. The storm of legends broke not with ships in the sky, but with fire in the streets. It began with the dreamers of light, whose processions had grown vast, their hymns echoing through the hive like bells long since melted. They marched by the thousands, candles raised, chanting of endurance and radiant return. The whispered, cloaked in ash, met them at a crossroads. No words were exchanged. The silence of one faith and the chanting of the other clashed, and in that collision lay violence. Torches became weapons, knives flashed. When it was done, the crossroads was littered with bodies, their blood soaking into stone that remembered the Aquila only faintly. The aftermath was worse. Survivors carried tales of slaughter back to their districts, each side claiming martyrdom, each side stoking flames of vengeance. Within days, barricades were raised, neighborhoods fortified, alleys turned into front lines. Legends had not only fractured the people, they had armed them. Hymns became war cries, silence became a weapon, and the hive became a crucible where faith itself was melted into blood. Beyond the hive, the echoes spread. Villages aligned themselves with one faith or the other, or with stranger myths still. In the plains, a sect calling themselves the Keepers of the Ash claimed that saints would rise from the dust of burned fields, demanding sacrifice of children to fertilize the soil. In the mountains, wanderers preached of an emperor who had abandoned his throne, leaving the galaxy to be tested, and promised that those who endured famine without anger would inherit a new dawn. None of these tales could be proven, yet all of them grew, for proof was irrelevant when belief itself was survival. It was during this time that the first true miracles, or the appearance of them, were recorded. In the Underhive, a statue of Saint Charon, long rusted and forgotten, was said to have opened its eyes, glowing faintly in the dark. In the basilica ruins, witnesses swore that melted bells rang by themselves, their tones hollow but clear. Some claimed it was the emperor reaching across the silence. Others whispered it was the warp seeping into the cracks left by neglect. The truth mattered less than the fervor it ignited. Pilgrims flocked to the sites, dragging themselves through famine and ash to kneel before stone that did not speak. Faith, once starved, now feasted on any crumb of wonder. The Arbite's fortress became the axis of a new legend. Rumors said its gates would open not for warlords or priests, but for the pure of heart, the ones who had not betrayed the emperor even in silence. Pilgrims gathered outside its sealed walls, lighting candles that guttered in the wind. They prayed, sang, and sometimes starved to death, waiting for a miracle that never came. Others took a darker view, claiming the fortress was cursed, that it contained horrors locked away by Arbites who had fallen to madness. At night, scavengers told of screams echoing from within, though no one could say whether they were real or imagined. The more legends grew, the less reality mattered. People no longer measured days by hunger alone, but by the stories they carried. A vision was worth more than bread. A miracle was worth more than water. Tyrants who once rationed food now rationed myths, spreading their own prophecies to keep the starving obedient. And the people obeyed, not because the stories were true, but because they had nothing else left to cling to. Thus the silence of abandonment became filled, not with the emperor's voice, but with 1,000 others, each echoing louder than the last. And in that chorus of contradiction, the world itself seemed to teeter on the edge of madness. For when stories become more powerful than survival, a world ceases to simply endure. It begins to dream, and dreams in a galaxy scarred by the warp are never innocent. Chapter 5. The Return That Never Comes. Generations passed beneath an empty sky. The children who once asked when the Emperor's angels would descend grew old, their questions left unanswered, their voices hoarse from silence. The tithe ships never came, the Vox never flared alive, the banners of the Imperium rotted to ribbons in the wind. What remained of Kethis Prime was not the world the Administratum had catalogued, nor the faithful bastion once counted among the Emperor's countless holdings. It was something else entirely, something forged in abandonment, hardened by famine, and scarred by belief twisted beyond recognition. The hive that had once been the beating heart of the planet was now a labyrinth of ruins, carved into fiefdoms that no longer remembered their origin. Children were born in the shadow of barricades and raised never knowing the sound of manufactora thunder, never tasting food that was not hoarded, stolen, or grown in hidden plots. To them, the Aquila was not history but rumor, a symbol seen carved into ancient stone, its meaning as foreign as the stars themselves. They did not ask when the Imperium would return. They asked instead which legend was truest, which dream gave them strength enough to endure. Some still clung to the dreamers of light, their torches burning in endless procession, chanting hymns to a radiant return that never arrived. Others bowed their heads with the whispered, waiting for a silence deeper than any yet known. The Ash Apostles, the Knives of Luther, the children of Saint Daskir, each endured, each reshaped by decades of hunger into something resembling permanence. What had begun as gangs and cults became lineages, dynasties of belief passed down from parent to child, each swearing loyalty not to Terra, but to the story that had given their ancestors the will to survive. The Arbite's fortress, that silent tomb of stone and steel, still loomed above it all. Its gates remained sealed, its towers unlit. Pilgrims still came, lighting candles at its base, whispering prayers to doors that had never opened. To them, it was no longer a bastion of law but a relic of faith, a holy site whose silence was itself the miracle. To others, it was a warning, proof that even the strongest walls and the harshest laws crumbled into nothing in the face of time. Whether revered or feared, it remained, the last monument of the Imperium's presence, watching impassively as the world remade itself without it. Rumors of return never ceased. Each streak of light in the sky became prophecy. Each wandering ship in the void was believed to carry angels. Each flicker of the warp whispered to herald salvation. But the return never came. The Astronomican's glow, if it still reached this place at all, was faint beyond measure. The great machine of the Imperium had moved on, devouring new tithes from other worlds, fighting other wars, bleeding other children. Kethis Prime was nothing to it now, dust, forgotten, irrelevant. And yet, in that irrelevance, life endured. Crops grew in ruined plazas, watered by scavenged pipes. Children laughed in alleyways, their games cruel but alive. Songs were sung in the dark, not of Terra or saints, but of survival. The world had been abandoned, yes, but it had not died. Instead, it had become something else, something unclaimed and ungoverned. Its people no longer waited for salvation. They no longer prayed for angels. They carried their own myths, their own burdens, their own truths. And in the silence of the void above, that endurance was its own defiance. The further the Imperium's memory faded, the sharper the planet's own identity became. No longer did the people speak of themselves as servants of Terra, but as heirs of survival, inheritors of a trial no god or angel had delivered them from. The language itself began to shift. Prayers became oaths. Sermons became songs. The Emperor's name was still spoken, but more often as curse than devotion, a bitter syllable spat into the dirt before the first bite of bread. The dreamers of light dwindled into something closer to ritual theater. Their processions became pageants of survival, torches lifted high as they chanted not of hope, but of endurance, that the flame itself must be carried even if no dawn followed. The whispered, by contrast, grew stronger, their silence spreading like a second faith across districts and villages alike. To bow one's head and say nothing became not just belief, but law. To speak of return was heresy. To speak of abandonment was truth. Children of new generations barely understood the meaning of Terra. They did not know the Astronomican or the Golden Throne. Those were tales told by elders whose eyes still remembered starlight. To the young, the Imperium was nothing more than a half-remembered myth, a tale of angels and warships more fanciful than the stories of saints walking the wastelands. The banners of the Aquila, when found in ruins, were sometimes taken as cloth for clothing, sometimes burned as kindling, and sometimes hung with reverence in shrines that no one could fully explain. And still, the fortress loomed. Children who had never seen an Arbite's patrol knew its silhouette, its walls black against the gray sky. They told stories of what lay behind its gates, vaults of food enough to feed all, or vaults of fire that would incinerate the world if opened. For them, the fortress was less history than fairy tale, a mountain carved by me, and long dead. It did not matter whether anyone lived inside anymore. Its silence was its truth, and its truth was eternal. As decades turned, new rulers rose, warlords claiming dynastic names, prophets declaring bloodlines traced back to saints or martyrs. Their cruelty hardened into tradition, their tyranny written into law. And yet, even here, resistance sparked. The remnants, once a rumor of scavengers who knelt to no warlord, survived in secret. Their symbol, the red flame, flickered on walls in places too hidden for tyrants to erase. Children whispered of them in games, pretending to be flame-bearers running through alleys, carrying rebellion in their hands. The fire never burned brightly, but it never went out. Above it all, the stars remained barren. No ships came. No vox stirred. The people looked upward still, but not with hope, with suspicion, with bitterness, with the quiet certainty that the sky was not their salvation, but their grave. Yet in that grave, they lived. They tilled soil. They forged knives. They told stories. And in those stories, the Imperium's silence had become more than neglect. It had become the defining shape of their world. They were not the Emperor's children. They were not Terra's loyal sons. They were something else, something left behind, yes, but something that endured anyway. And endurance, in a galaxy built on cruelty, is the rarest miracle of all. By the 2nd century of silence, the question was no longer whether the Imperium would return. That hope had burned out like the last candle in a forgotten shrine. The question had become whether the world had ever truly belonged to the Imperium at all. Elders remembered the ships, the tithes, the sermons, but their words fell on ears that had never seen such things, ears that had grown up in a world where only hunger and legend held sway. For the young, the Imperium was myth, no different from the saints in the ashlands or the fire-eyed figures said to walk the wastelands at dusk. Some clung to fragments of the old creed. A handful of families still lit votive candles to the Emperor each night, though their children asked them why they prayed to a god who had left them to starve. Others carved the aquila into stone, not as devotion but as warding, believing the symbol frightened away the shadows that slipped through dreams. Belief had become talisman rather than faith, stripped of its meaning, surviving only as superstition. Yet not all fragments withered. The dreamers of light still carried their torches, though their songs had shifted from hope to defiance. The light endures, they chanted, even if the dawn does not come. The whispered still pressed their foreheads to the dust, their silence growing into law in villages where speech itself was rationed. The Ash Apostles still fed their people from sacrificial fires, claiming the Emperor himself devoured the fallen and returned them as sustenance. What once had been cults had calcified into nations, their banners stitched from generations of blood. And above them all, the fortress still stood. Entire pilgrimages were born around it. Families walking across wastes to lay offerings at its gates, their bones bleaching in the sun when starvation overtook them. Some called it the Tomb of Faith, others the House of An, Gels, others still the Cage of Tyrants. No one entered, no one left. Its silence had outlived every prophecy, and in that endurance, it became eternal. Whispers of off-worlders never stopped. Once a decade, perhaps, someone would claim to have seen engines burning in the sky, shapes sliding through clouds like steel leviathans. But no ship ever landed, no signal was ever received. Sometimes a crater would be found in the ashlands, and scavengers would swear it was the wreck of a void craft, though no evidence ever proved it. The galaxy might still exist beyond the sky, but Kethis Prime had been cut from its story. The most haunting truth was that this severance did not kill the world. It transformed it. Crops grew in soil mixed with ash. Children learned to fight before they learned to write. Songs were sung not of Terra, but of survival, of the ancestors who had endured the silence and carved meaning from abandonment. The Imperium had abandoned Kethis Prime, yes, but in doing so, it had created something the Administratum could never have recorded, something the Ecclesiarchy could never have controlled. A people who had survived without gods, without angels, without Terra. For those who still prayed, the silence was a wound that never healed. For those who no longer prayed, it was liberation. Either way, the truth was the same. The return never came, and the longer it did not, the less it mattered. Kethis Prime was no longer waiting, it was becoming,